Welcome to this special live broadcast on WDEV from Bridgeside Books in Waterbury. Tonight we have a very special conversation between author and activist Bill McKibben and Ken Squire, who doesn't need too much introduction to this audience. I'm David Goodman. I'm host of the Vermont Conversation, which airs Wednesdays at 1 on WDEV, and I will be moderating tonight. We will, as usual on WDEV, be taking questions both from a live audience at Bridgeside Books, but also from our radio audience. And you can call the usual call-in numbers of WDEV, 244-1777, or toll-free 877-291-8255. This special broadcast is brought to you tonight by the Vermont Natural Resources Council. Through research, education, collaboration, and advocacy, VNRC protects and enhances Vermont's natural environments, vibrant communities, productive working landscapes, rural character, and unique sense of place, and prepares the state for future challenges and opportunities. Join the movement today by becoming a member at vnrc.org. And it's also sponsored tonight by the Alchemist Brewery of Waterbury and Stowe, who are committed to quality craft beer, strong communities, and a healthy and clean environment. You can stop by their brewery and visitor center in Stowe to taste their beer or get some swag. They're open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 to 7, and you can learn more at alchemistbeer.com, or as the three of us are enjoying their heady topper here at Bridgeside Books tonight. So, we are here tonight because of a new book that Bill McKibben has written. It is called Radio Free Vermont, A Fable of Resistance. And we are, of course, broadcasting on the real Radio Free Vermont. And so with no further ado, Bill McKibben, tell us a little bit about, you are the author of 16 books, but until now, no novels. This is your first. What was your inspiration?
Well, that's correct. This is the first fiction, David, that I've ever written on purpose. And nothing could make me happier than to get to be in Waterbury to talk about it on WDEV, because if there is a spiritual home for this particular novel, this is it, for many reasons. First, let me say many thanks to the good people at VNRC, and many thanks to the people here at Bridgeside Books. People keep asking me, can you get this book anywhere? By which I think they mean, can you get it on Amazon? And I always say, yeah, you can get it anywhere, but you should get it at your local bookstore. The communities that took their local bookstores for granted no longer have them, so it's incredibly important. Look, I've been gaily signing books here tonight, but really people who are here in attendance, if you really want a signature on this book, it should probably be Ken Squire's, because in a sense, he's probably the main inspiration for this volume. I wrote 15 years ago now, maybe, Ken, a profile for Harper's Magazine of WDEV and mostly of Ken. And it was one of the things that lingered in the back of my mind for a long time as I was working on this book. Talk about taking things for granted. We're all so used to WDEV that I think we forget that there's basically nothing like it left in the United States. The station that is intensely local, but intensely creative, always doing interesting things and stretching, and that's a reflection of Ken in so many ways. I'll say the other reason that Waterbury is the right place for us to be tonight is because one of the leitmotifs of this book is beer. It's pretty well soaked in beer, it must be said. I wrote back in the early 1980s for the Village Voice, now deceased, the Village Voice, but I wrote what was the first story, I think, in a major American publication about what we then called microbreweries. And at the time, there were 10 or 11 of them in the whole country, really almost the first and the only, there was Greg Noonan in Vermont, at Vermont Pub and Brewery, maybe the Catamount Brewery, and just one or two others up here in the Northeast. We went around to all of them, and the beer tasted good, but what tasted even better was the fact that this was the kind of first act of standing up to an increasingly homogenized, corporatized, commodified culture. Beer is really where it began. In the 1970s, in the UK, with the campaign for real ale that crossed the pond, and suddenly there were brewers all, and now, of course, Vermont has just become the epicenter of all of this. The Alchemist actually plays a role in this book. At the climactic scene in the book, the Alchemist appears. Sometimes when things get very hyped and everyone, and the Alchemist always gets voted the best beer on the planet, and Eddie Topper does and things, and sometimes it's you finally get somewhere and it's not quite as amazing. I remember the first time that I went to the Grand Canyon, and I remember thinking when I got to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, this is even better than I thought it was going to be. This is even grander than the name, And I remember the first time I ever tasted Eddie Topper. Okay, this really is. I mean, we have magnificent beer all across this state, thank heaven. As in Middlebury, where I am, we have plenty of great brewers. Otter Creek does magnificent stuff and things. But what a pleasure to be up here and to be reminded always, the point of this book has a lot to do with smallness, with localness, with community. It's the story of a small band of Vermonters led by a septuagenarian longtime radio host. I'm not sure he's still a septuagenarian. Who decided that maybe the time has come for Vermont once again to be its own republic. And it's a kind of accidental accidental rebellion. And I actually don't think it's probably a very great idea for Vermont to secede. Although ask me in the second Trump administration, I have a different take on it. We're an older state. It's possible that all they'd have to do is threaten to cut off Social Security and we'd all capitulate. But I do think it's incredibly important for us to take seriously the fact that we have something very good here, that sense of smallness and localness and community that DEV, among other things, has done so much to nurture over the years, to take it seriously and to defend it, especially in a moment when it really does seem, at least to me, as if our national political life has gone off the rails. I'd be curious to hear what Ken and David have to say about this. People ask me, I've been traveling around the country doing my usual organizing for 350, but also doing a little bit of talking about this book. And people often say, why is Vermont different? And it's actually a hard question to answer. I mean, in demographic terms, we're extremely rural, and we're, as you know, about as white as it's possible to get, so we probably should be fairly Trumpish, and Vermont, New Hampshire directly to the east is kind of Trumpish, and upstate New York directly to the west is sort of, and so what happened? The best, it may have something to do with our history, the fact that we were a republic for 15 years before we joined, that may have imprinted on our DNA a little bit. And partly, I think it must have to do something with the institution of town meeting. And with the idea that coming together to govern ourselves has required us to learn how to be neighborly in a way that maybe isn't so much in the rest of our political life anymore. I try to imagine what would happen if Donald Trump came to town meeting in Ripton, where I live, and started talking the way that he talks when he tweets and things. people would just look at him slack-jawed for a minute, and then tell him to sit down, and that this was not helpful, and on we would go. So that sense of neighborliness is extraordinarily important, I think. One of the things I've written about a lot over the years in nonfiction is community. For 50 or 75 years in America, for the most part, neighbors have been optional. You haven't really needed your neighbors for any practical purpose. If you had a credit card, someone will deliver your groceries to your door now. You never have to. That's been less true in Vermont because we're so rural and because of institutions like town meeting and because of the lessons. We really learned that lesson after Irene, how much we relied on each other. My guess from my work on climate change is that the era of optional neighbors is over in this country. We meet here tonight while people in the second biggest city in the country, in Los Angeles, are terrified, wondering if their house is about to burn down, and coming together as best they can to try and protect each other. I think that has more to do with the future, and it's why I hope that we're able so much to kind of keep Vermont on somewhat the same track that we have. So I really want to say nothing more than just thanks to Ken, not just for the good example he's set, but also for the fact that, 18 hours a day anyway, WDEV, or 19 hours a day, I think, WDEV just keeps us all connected in a really powerful. I know that's where my radio is always set. That's how I learn about and understand the world around me, and I'm awfully, awfully grateful for it.
Well, that's I want you to share a little bit. This has been this new little book by Bill McKibben, Radio Free Vermont, is my favorite read of this year. This is kind of a updated, modernized Edward Abbey monkey wrench gang takes over America via this radio broadcaster, Ken Squire. Vern Barkley. Sorry. And as the intro to the book says, as the sole host of Radio Free Vermont, quote, underground, underpowered, and underfoot, 72-year-old Vern Barkley is currently broadcasting from, quote, an undisclosed and double-secret location. So, Bill, can you just sketch out the storyline of this madcap fable that includes, I think, a sampling of almost every micro-brewed beer in Vermont that I've ever heard of, and some I haven't, and this radio man who is leading this revolution, and we'll hear from him shortly, but for the moment he's going to have to hear himself talked about in the third person through someone else's name.
Well, so the book actually opens with a couple of small acts of rebellion. This is a very nonviolent revolution that's underway, but one of the first acts of it is that a couple of followers of Vern Barkley stop a beer truck coming in from New York carrying a freight of Coors Light, and they divert it down a farm track and take the air out of the tires, and then start draining all the bottles of 1,200 cartons of Coors Light, and replace them in the truck with a gift pack of beers from all of Vermont's 78 brewers. And at one point, the driver says, "This is taking a very long time while you drain all those cartons. Why don't you just toss the Coors over the side if you hate it so much?" And the woman who's in a balaclava who stopped the truck looks up at him and says, "Oh, sweetie, this is Vermont. We recycle." And that sort of sets the mood for this adventure. their main way of communication is via podcast, because they can't really do a radio broadcast because it'd be too easy for the police and eventually the feds to track them down. So they're in a hold up in a farmhouse in Starksboro, making podcasts, as it were, and getting them out online. But the radio host, Vern, he's actually, I think he's a tiny bit vain about his abilities as a broadcaster, and he keeps thinking, I really need to be able to talk to people directly. You have to be able to have them call in and speak to me. For many years, whenever Mark Johnson went on vacation and Ken took over the morning show, we had a pretty steady thing where I would come on for time after time, and always was one of the things I most looked forward to talking to, because precisely how good he was at talking to people. So they're headed towards town meeting day. That's going to be the kind of climax where people around the state are going to vote about whether or not they want to secede. And so taking their chances, they surface a little bit at the very end, a couple of nights before town meeting, to do a statewide broadcast on the radio. And Vern is taking calls from around the state. And the last one, just as they're about to have to cut it off because the police are going to find them, a fellow calls in from Essex Junction. Art calls in and says, I think this secession idea is the stupidest idea in the world. The U.S. is the greatest country on the planet. If we were off by ourselves, we'd be crushed. We'd be Haiti with Holsteins, he says. And Vern says, well, I disagree with you. I think we'd be Finland with fall colors. But you may be right. He says. And that was taken directly from, I'd heard Ken once, many years ago, when I was writing that piece for Harper's, talking about, I think you were intemperately talking about the death penalty, probably, and saying someone or another should be, and someone called in and said the death penalty is a terrible idea, which I think it is, serves no useful purpose, and here's why, and it gave a long list, and so on, and at the end, Ken said, well, I disagree with you, but you may be right. And I think that's precisely the thing you never, ever hear on the radio or the TV or anything else anymore. I mean, we've just reached this place where we yell at each other, and you're a bigot, you're a feminazi, you're a socialist, you're a fascist, you're whatever you are. Look, I have very firm convictions about the world, and I have the arrest record to prove that I mean it, and so on. But I can't stand the kind of rancor and bitterness, and one of the reasons I put this, I've been writing this book for years, mostly just to have an excuse to be thinking about Vermont while I was traveling. And I wasn't even going to publish it probably ever, but I decided this year I should, if I was ever going to, because it was funny, and because this year seems like not the year for one of my usual depressing we're just like the whole nation has taken a dose of reverse Prozac. And jittery and sad all the time, and whatever. But above all, that kind of ugliness that's infested our political life, where people from, and it's no accident where it's coming from the very top down, just feel free to say the worst possible things about each other at all times. That's too bad, and that's not where we should be. And I hope Vermont never, ever gets any place close to there.
Okay, we're talking on a special live broadcast from Bridgeside Books and WDEV tonight. We're talking with Bill McKibben, author and activist and founder of 350.org, and Ken Squire, the legendary broadcaster and owner of WDEV. We're going to take a short break for our sponsor, come right back, and we'll hear from Ken Squire himself, his thoughts on being the leader of the revolution. So, folks, there is Hayata, who is the bookstore owner, in case you didn't know, is passing out yellow sticky notes. And if you have questions, feel free to take a note, write it down, and pass them back to Hayata. And Hayata, you can just give them all to me in a clump, and we'll start turning to them when we come back. We're back at Bridgeside Books on this special broadcast, an evening with Bill McKibben and Ken Squire. I'm David Goodman, host of the Vermont Conversation, and we are talking about Bill's new book, Radio Free Vermont, which is a barely disguised parable about with a star character named Vern Barkley, who most of us might know as Ken Squire. So Ken, you've now had a book written where you are the leader of the revolution. And Bill has asked this question, what's so special about Vermont? What makes it different? Now, you travel the country and the world in your travels as covering NASCAR and other things. How do you answer that? How do you explain what's so special about Vermont?
Well, there's no sense in getting into that until I am allowed to put right here in the book. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, business companies, events, or locales is entirely coincidental. So I rest my case. Now, what was the question?
It has to do with you as the leader of a revolution with which Vermont saves the world, and you then being a hunted man, connecting with your followers only through this bandit airwaves, which most of us know as WDEV.
Well, that's probably semi-accurate. In other words, 50% of it is true, which is about the way we get our information these days now, isn't it? That's a very difficult question. And your partner to the right stung me with that 10 or 12 years ago. Nothing was more frightening than the potential for Bill McKibben to show up in Waterbury to talk about WDEV. Jeez. Next thing you want to do is go to Thunder Road, and I thought, that's the end. No hope whatsoever. He turned out to be a pretty good fellow. Had a pretty steady understanding about what we wanted to be, what we tried to be, what we never will be. But DEV was created in 1931. A fellow named Harry Whitehill down here at 9 Stowe Street published the Waterbury Record. He was a conservative. And he also published the Stowe Weekly. And he was a bit involved in politics and all of that. And he had a keen ear and an eye for what was going on, not only in Waterbury, but in the world around him. And he discovered that there was this thing called radio. And this thing called radio had real potential, not necessarily used to its best, but was used. And he thought that would be a pretty good thing. And he came back to Waterbury from a trip to somewhere and said to Lloyd Squire, who was a kid around town, lost his father in the First World War. Well, he never came home. We don't know quite where he went, but do that as it may. Anyway, he thought about it, and around 1929, it was he who said, Lloyd, more people can hear than can read. And I think we ought to be in the radio business. That's the truth. And he had a book about 3 times as thick as this that he purchased down in Boston on one of his trips. He said, you read this thing and this will tell you all about how to build a radio station. And you'll go down and get a license down there at the customs house and come back and we'll have a radio station. Well, there's a lot of things my dad could do, but he couldn't engineer from here to 9 Snow Street. It was a disaster. And meanwhile, they bought all this equipment, tinkered around, and they took what was the print shop in the back of 9 Snow Street, began to make a few conversions, and then they decided they needed to take some space out of the stationery store, which was in the front. And they finally had that kind of rigged up, and they built a tower. They built a tower from the back of 9 Stowe Street down to the funeral parlor, and with a copper wire, and that was the tower. And that seemed to work pretty good as far as Lloyd was concerned. So he went back down to get his license, and it was worse. And the guy said, where are you? And he said, well, we're in Waterbury, Vermont. He said, what's that near? He said, well, it's sort of near Burlington and sort of near Montpelier. He says, and that's where you are? And he said, yes. And he said, well, I'm going to give you a temporary license to proceed, and then come back in a few months and we'll see if you can get this straightened around as to what is needed to properly put a radio station on the air. Well, there was so much work in those days, as I understand, getting all the programming ready, arranging for artists to appear, deciding how they were going to finance it, which meant getting out, getting on with selling the thing, and they worked themselves into a sweat. And finally, in July of 1931, they were ready to go for 1 hour a day. Meanwhile, it was a raving success, mostly because Harry made it that way in his weekly newspaper. Nobody had heard the damn thing, except that they had those signals and you could send in postcards from wherever you heard it. And whatever postcard came in that went up and bounced off the whatever was sent in. And my God, they were getting mail from California and Maryland and Virginia. And they knew they were on their way. So after they'd been on for 3 or 4 months, 1931, Harry admitted that there was such a potential with radio that they might be able to hire an engineer. And they hired a fellow from Barre, Vermont. He went on to be the producer of the Bob Hope Show about 20 years later. And what they created was their idea of what radio should be. And come to find out, wasn't such a bad idea. It was to be all things to all people. Well, my God, you can't do that. You know, in this modern day of radio broadcasting, you're either adult contemporary, super contemporary, non-contemporary, country, non-country, classical, and so on down the line. And somewhere in there was news. Well, news was a passion with Lloyd because he worked for the Waterbury Record and with Harry Whitehill. And so from the very beginning, they read the news every day, right out of yesterday's Free Press. And it was quite a success. People were fascinated to hear someone read those stories to them. And next thing you know, they were on several hours a day, And pretty soon they hired a news director. That sort of confused and compounded the problem, because then there was differences of opinion. But the differences of opinion didn't seem to bother anybody. You know, as long as everybody had a place where they could bite down hard and chew on it, they were okay with it. And that's exactly what happened. And it never changed. And they decided they needed to do sports, because that was a part of the community too. It was part of Waterbury and all of that. And I'll tell you a funny story. Bill Randall and Bill Wicker were in with my dad in that deal. And Bill came in and he said, "Lloyd, if we're going to do basketball, we have to have a studio to do it in. You know, my God, we can't afford to build a studio wherever you're going to do a game." He says, "I've got an idea." And he took them up to Montpelier, and there it was. It was a piano case, and you cut the front of it out, and you could slither into it, and there you had your own studio. So they took it down to the community center in Montpelier, behind the office building there, and they did their first games. They were tournament games, and Waterbury played Montpelier, something like that. And they got into the sports business. And that's what it was all about. The things that people did and they were interested in at that time and in this place. It's never changed. And so really, all I've done is the same thing they all did. And don't know any better than to do just that and nothing more.
If radio listeners have questions that they would like Bill McKibben and Ken Squire to answer, you can call them in to WDEV at 244-1777 or toll free 877-291-8255. We're going to turn now to some questions from our live audience. And let's see, they're being passed up here. And one that I think I'll go to here is the questioner writes, "I know that certain words are prohibited on the radio. What do you think of prohibiting two words from ever appearing in the same sentence, the words Trump and president?" Well, okay, Ken is deferring to Bill on this one.
It is a strange moment in our national political life, it must be said. I work with a lot of young people all over the place, and most of them don't much like Donald Trump, but their experience, they have an N of 2 with presidents. They, you know, if you're in college, you know Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So it's hard to explain to them sometimes that it's not that, I mean, there's been plenty of presidents I didn't much care for and whatever in my lifetime, but that there's something qualitatively different about this guy from everybody before. And if I had to explain it, it would be that every other president, an unappreciated virtue of all former presidents was you could forget about them for days or weeks at a time. And this guy is just in your face 24, he gets up in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, and starts tweeting crazy things that you would not, if your child said it, you'd send them to their room, and if your father said it, you'd send them to a home. You know, it's bad. It just keeps you all the time kind of upset. And I think that that's actually part of the strategy, is to sort of keep everybody off balance all the time, doing, you know, and there's so much nuttiness going on all the time that you don't notice that they've just passed some tax bill that, you know, just takes all the money out of your pocket and hands it to some billionaire someplace, you know. So it's when I get very despairing, one of the things that I reassure myself with is the fact that by far the most popular politician in America, going by polls and things, is our junior senator, who brings an interesting mix of, Vermont and Brooklyn to the board, and I think is very much, I remember Ken telling me, we were talking about Bernie 15 years ago, before he was a senator, I think, before he was a senator, and you said, well, the first time, because remember all the candidates used to come out to Thunder Road and have a cow chip tossing contest, right? and you said, I was worried the first time Bernie came out, I thought all the people from the Northeast Kingdom and all the guys from Pitt Row and stuff would, he's not like them. He said, I was surprised when Bernie appeared for the first time there, and everybody was standing up and cheering him. Under the sort of immediate understanding that he actually, all politicians say that they're for the little guy, but everyone actually knows that Bernie, whatever his actually is for the little guy, had come through. So I take a certain amount of hope that we'll regain our political equilibrium at some point and get someplace else, but there's a lot of damage going on at the moment, and I don't know quite how it's all going to end.
May I get in on that?
Yes, Ken Squire.
I'd like to get in on that because Bernie showed up at WDEV and said he wanted a 1-hour program. He'd pay for it. And of course, that's part of the deal. Anybody understand? Well, I didn't know but what he was a public radio enthusiast. We think that we could donate the time. My purple bunny. Anyway, he wanted to do this 1-hour program. And we said, well, here's what it costs us for engineers and so forth, and we had it broken down. Because we used to do the country fairs and stuff, cover the horses and the pigs and all anything that raced. And he took a look at it and said, okay, I'll do it. I want to do it. I want to get the message out. Well, he was on for 2 or 3 weeks, and the message was the same thing every time. It was a mantra that he had absolutely down cold, and he did it pretty darn well. But it was about as interesting as wallpaper. I didn't know what we were going to do, and I called him up and I said, hey, you should take phone calls and let people ask you questions that they're concerned about. He said, no, because if I do that, they're going to lead me down the path into something else, and that's not what I want to do. I want to get my message across. So I knew we were headed down to his office. So, there's a guy named Huck Gutman down at the University of Vermont, and he was very much responsible for how people dealt with Bernie in the old days. And so I talked to Huck, and I said, this isn't working for him nor for us, because he's doing this thing that he knows how to do, but it's not talking to the people about what they want to know about. So Huck went by and gave it a shot and didn't go anywhere. And it went another week or so, and then there was a fellow over in Northfield. What's his name? The liberal show guy.
Tom Hartman.
Tom Hartman? Tom Hartman. Tom Hartman lived in Northfield, and he moved over to Montpelier, and he had a liberal program which was along the same line, similar, and he was a good writer, did the Lost Hours of Ancient Sunlight, and he wrote books about children's
Attention deficit.
yeah. And we said, hey, we got an idea. What if we took 1 hour, because he was on 3 hours a day, at that point he'd moved out to San Francisco, and we'll take 1 hour out of his program and put it on Friday, and you go on and it'll be like Lunch with Bernie, and see what happens. Well, Bernie's wife was also kind of the producer of what the show was. And they chewed it over and they thought they'd give it a try, and he was reticent to go with it, but he did. And the rest is history. He left us in about 6 months because he was on 65 or 70 stations all across the country. Because when he got out, and there was dialogue between him and the people, he came out pretty darn well. And until Hillary threw him under the bus, I thought he was doing pretty good. Well, I didn't mean to do that.
We're going to take a short break here for our sponsors. You're listening to a special live broadcast on WDEV from Bridgeside Books, a conversation with Bill McKibben and Ken Squire. I'm David Goodman. We'll be right back. Any other questions you have you want to pass up? Here?
I have one over here.
Okay.
Should be handing out the heady toppers, I think. You'll get questions then.
Can I have another if you drive home?
No.
Welcome back to this WDEV live broadcast from Bridgeside Books in Waterbury, a conversation between author and activist Bill McKibben, whose new book is Radio Free Vermont, and Ken Squire, who we all know, the owner of WDEV and a longtime journalist. I'm David Goodman, host of the Vermont Conversation on WDEV. We have a question from our audience. It says, and I think this is directed to Bill, working in community organizations, I saw the importance of need. Hearing you talk about Hurricane Irene and the Los Angeles fires, do you think that climate change the need for social supports will create a more cohesive community and nation?
Well, one doesn't know for sure because it could break either way. I mean, people in extremity, it could be that our response is really bad and that we, as things get worse in the United States because we're having fires and hurricanes and so on, that we sort of have a kind of fortress America, and that's sort of what's going on at the moment. It was a shameful, from my point of view, a really shameful moment this year when President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords. We're now, literally the only nation on the face of the earth that's refusing to cooperate in this joint effort to do something about the biggest problem that we face. Even a couple of weeks ago, even Syria, which is hardly even a functioning, autocracy, managed to get it together enough to join the Paris Climate Accords. Only the United States, which put more carbon into the atmosphere than any country on earth, refuses to, walked away from the promises that we've made in Paris. That's embarrassing. Sorry to go off on a rant. So it may be that we just, reinforce ourselves in our kind of selfishness. On the other hand, I do think it's possible that the response to climate change may do some good things. One is that coming together in the face of emergency, The other is that as we move towards, say, solar power, we start having more of our energy come from close to home, in the way that in Vermont, we've tried to have more of our food and all of our beer come from close to home as well, you know. Along with food, energy is the most important commodity that we produce. And I think, I don't know, I was in Africa this spring doing a piece for the New Yorker about the rapid spread, now that it's so cheap, of solar energy in parts of Africa. And it was really interesting to watch. I was in this community in Ghana, right near the equator, and 95 degrees all the time, and sitting and talking with the elders about this solar microgrid that they'd installed the week before, 40 solar panels that were powering these 70 huts in this community. And they kept handing me, as we were talking, bottles of cold water to drink, for which I was grateful. But in my clueless American way, it took me 10 minutes to figure out why they were so proud to be handing me cold bottles of water. Until the week before, there had never been anything cold in this. Cold was not even a concept that had really existed in this place before. And now, thanks to this solar panels, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of wizardry. I mean, you point a piece of glass with some silicon inlaid at the sun, and out the back comes heat or light or communications. I mean, that's sort of Hogwarts scale. You intercept the breeze for a minute, and suddenly you have all the things that you need, for energy coming out. That's really different than writing a check to the Koch brothers or to the Saudi Arabians or something every week for your oil. And so I think it's possible that as we deal with this crisis that we've fallen into, that we may figure out how to become somewhat more local. I hope so. But there's no sugarcoating it. I mean, it's going to be hard, and we should remember, and we always do remember, and when we went through Irene, we remember what it's like. Imagine what it's like in Puerto Rico right now. We have Sue Minter here, who was one of our recovery czars from Irene. Vermont, everybody pulled together, and within a few weeks, life had, for most people, returned to more or less something like normal. We're now 80, 90 days after this storm in Puerto Rico. Most people still don't have power. There's 1 million people without water. It's going to take 25 years, they think, for them to get back to the place economically that they were in August before things hit. So there's no underestimating just what a bad predicament we've wandered into at this point. Hopefully this will be one of the things that pulls us all together as a world politically. If democracy was built for anything, if the internet and our ability to communicate with everybody was built for anything, surely it was to respond to this particular first truly global problem we've ever faced. I'll just say, a lot of my colleagues were in Bonn for big climate talks last week, the first since our change of presidency. Everybody had been really worried that the rest of the world was going to follow us and just use Trump as an excuse not to do anything. It didn't really seem to be happening. Most of the world so far still seems to be willing to try and deal with this thing. So we shall see going forward.
I'm going to skip over 2 questions that I think I saw Ken writing himself before we got up here. The first one says, where did Ken get his good looks? And Ken, when are you going to write your memoirs? I really want to read them. So I'm going to ignore those, but nice try, Ken. And is there something, but I did want to say in all seriousness, you've been around a lot longer than me or Bill McKibben. Are you worried about the current moment that we find ourselves in?
Well, as far as writing my book, I am very concerned. There used to be several other people, some of whom live in this part of the world, who have to fall off their perch before I can really get down to serious business. About my book, however, my conscience, my daughter is with me, and that's supposed to straighten me out. It doesn't work worth a damn. No, what was the question?
The question is, you know, you were born in the 30s. You've seen the world kind of go to hell and back. Are you worried about the situation we're in now, and what do you think is the way forward? You're somebody who has his finger on the pulse of the community through the many hours you sit in those luxurious studios and take calls, so tell us, show us the way.
I don't think, all I can do is be as frustrated and as angry as I think everyone is, that we've come to this place in this country. And I don't have any answers, but I hope we can find people that do, and that we can listen to them and really pay attention. And to do that, we're going to have to put up with some things that we really don't want to hear about. But that's part of the game of life and living in a democracy. We have to pay attention to what other people are thinking and ask why. And that's part of what I think drives WDEV, and I could be as wrong as can be. But that there is a place where people can bring ideas and we can share them. And we've stuck to our guns on that. So we've got a program in the morning which is reasonably liberal. We've got and slightly conservative. Let me tell you, that's tricky. Then we have a real conservative show with a wonderful guy that graduated at the University of Chicago. And he, I think, represents the case very, very well. And after 1 o'clock, we go the other way, and we were able to dismiss 2 or 3 people that were firebrands, and we didn't need to burn the place down. All we wanted to do was get a conservative side, and we keep working on that. And we're not entirely happy, but one of the things we've learned is that one of the things that we don't ever talk about enough is our nature. And in this state, that counts for as much as anything, because our nature is so much of consequence, and people do have ideas about it, but they don't bring them forward because the newspapers have no place for it, the periodicals have little place for it, but every so often you find those magazines that do talk about our environment. And that's one of the reasons that I'm thrilled. This is the first time that McKibben and I have ever been on the same stage. This man has gone the whole road, the whole route, in trying to begin to direct us into other ways of thinking. My God, I wish he had a program. Because I think that people would pay attention, they'd call up, they'd give him hell, and he would react to it. And we would all be the better for it. And that's what changes the world. Listening to the same guys beating the same rug all the time. It gets a little dusty.
Bill McKibben, we are approaching the 30th anniversary of the publication of your first book, The End of Nature, which was a groundbreaking book regarded as the first for a general audience about climate change. So how do you reflect on 30 years after predicting what we're now seeing? What's your perspective?
Well, mostly, I wish to hell I'd been wrong about it all. There's no satisfaction, it turns out, at all in being proved right. And if I guessed 30 years ago, I wouldn't have guessed that, and the scientists wouldn't have guessed that things would have happened as quickly as they're happening. Climate change happening, and I wouldn't have guessed that our political reaction would have happened as slowly as it's been happening. I didn't understand at first. I thought we were in an argument about climate change, and if we wrote a lot of books and had a lot of articles and seminars and things, that eventually we'd get on the right track and do what we needed to do. It turned out that was a bad misunderstanding on my part. We weren't really in an argument about it. We won the argument early on. The science was very, very clear. We were in a fight, and a fight is always about money and power, and the fossil fuel industry just turned out to have so much money and power that they've been able to kind of delay action, maybe past the critical point. We'll see. But so I, at a certain point, I turned from just writing about this to trying to, turn myself into a not very credible activist about it all. And we started this thing, 350.org. It's so much fun to see the 350 Vermont people here tonight. And we're doing what we can, but I am, this book that we're talking about tonight, this novel we called A Fable of Resistance, and it really was, along with being a love letter to Vermont, it was kind of a mash note to that resistance too, that I've been a part of for 10 or 15 years, and it's really blossomed a lot in this last year around the country, and I think is really important. The other kind of, the sort of standard kinds of military resistance and things we know a lot about. You can go to West Point or Annapolis or Norwich, or you can go to there's hundreds of people who study military history. In the bookstore you can find 100 books by Tom Clancy all about this other thing, this kind of resistance that we started kind of learning about 100 years ago, maybe with people like Gandhi and Dr. King and everybody who engages in it, and lots of people engage in it in lots of ways, all just kind of make it up as they go along a little bit. And one of the things I was trying to do with this book is remind us that that there are lots of creative ways to engage in it, beyond just the sort of normal things that we do of petitions and so on and so forth. I wanted the book to be funny, in part because, environmentalists and activists in general have many, many virtues, but sense of humor is not always at the absolute top of the list, and that's a mistake. We've done a good job of appealing to whatever half of the human brain it is that likes bar graphs and pie charts, but not a very good job of appealing to the other part, whichever other lobe it is. And so art and music and humor, those are the things that that allow us both to resist and in the process to build the kind of communities that are worth resisting for, If the whole thing was just to be on Twitter battling it out, well then it wouldn't be worth it in the end anyway, because it's not instead there's something deeper that needs to happen. And so I don't know what, 30 years hasn't gone that well in all of this, I gotta say. I don't know what the next 30 years will bring, but I hope that it brings a good deal more of that we learn how not only to resist the things that are most dangerous, but how in the process to build the kind of communities that really are strong and good. And so, of all the things that happen on WDEV every week, one of the things that I like the very most and try never to miss is, Saturday morning at 9 o'clock when it's time for music to go to the dump bar. Because, one really needs a certain number of fart jokes and things to just kind of make it through the week. That's part of life as well, and I couldn't be more grateful to Mr. Swire for providing that. And in the process, though it just seems like a kind of small part, it's truly one of the ways that we knit together communities that work.
Good work. Good work.
So we're going to give Ken Squire the last word here.
Well, I'm honored that he listens, but I don't think he really hears the message. I have a question to you. How many copies of The End of Nature get sold these days? Do people still read that book?
They do still read the book, but not as many copies as we'd like to see.
I have to repeat the answer.
Yeah, I couldn't hear her either. I'm deaf.
Anna said she complimented you on your good looks. No. She said that the End of Nature is still read, but not as many as it used to be.
Because what this thing tonight has represented, as far as I'm concerned, is my mantra, which I've developed mostly by what I followed with the motorsports folks. And that is the greatness of this country is created by the common man doing uncommon deeds. And we have to decipher what those deeds are and what ones are responsible and which ones we could do without. But it has been those people, rather the Civil War, World War II, which was such a terrible thing, and what we're going through now, which is a continuing year after year, 17 years in Europe. Jeez, it's awful. And we use up our treasure and we use up our children, and it seems to be without end. And somewhere along we have to... Well, I guess it's time for me to go.
Okay, well that's going to do it for our special live broadcast on WDEV from Bridgeside Books in Waterbury, a conversation with Bill McKibben and Ken Squire in honor of the publication of Bill McKibben's new book, Radio Free Vermont. Our broadcast tonight has been brought to you by Vermont Natural Resources Council and the Alchemist Brewery of Waterbury and Stowe. I'm David Goodman, host of the Vermont Conversation on WDEV. Thanks so much for listening.